Welcome to the Elevate podcast. This series focuses on elevating and inspiring women and girls into or to remain in the tech sector from the classroom to the boardroom. I'm Kelly Kwarteng, founder and CEO of Helzac and host of the show. Welcome to the Elevate Women in Tech podcast series, where we explore the challenges, successes and strategies for creating a more inclusive and equitable tech industry. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking to Robert Baker, a renowned ally and advocate for women in tech and our first male guest on the show. This episode covers the importance of male allyship in supporting gender equality and empowering women in the tech industry, the barriers and challenges women face in this field, and how to engage men as allies without making them feel threatened or marginalised in the process. So Robert, first up, thanks a lot for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. Wow, what an honour to be the first man on your podcast series. Delighted that, and it's interesting because I've had a number of firsts in this kind of regard. So I was the first man on the board of a women's network, for example, and the first man to be joining the board of European Women on Board. So there's been a really kind of groundbreaking aspect to sort of some of the involvement that I've had with gender equality and women in tech over the years. But what's really good now is to see so many more men who are in this field. So I think you'll have an opportunity to have more men guests, I think, on over time, and be interesting to see how that whole discussion evolves.
I hope so, and I hope that this will be that first step into encouraging more men to want to come on and talk about experiences and topics and everything else for our guests. I think to get us started, because some of our guests might not know who you are, I think if you're active in the D&I space, most people know who you are that are on the circuit. But for our guests that don't, I think it would be really great if you could introduce yourself, tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why and how you got into the work that you're doing today.
Sure. Wow. So I suppose from a career point of view, I spent 40 years in the global HR consulting world, working with a company called Mercer, which was a fabulous, experience and wonderful colleagues, etc. I left to set up my own business in January 2020, just after 40 years, if you like, with the company. So it was a great career, but I wanted to go on and do my own thing. Unfortunately, the pandemic was just arriving at that time, so it wasn't a great time to be starting out on my own. But what I found is since then, the connections that I've got and the network that I've built has really helped me build up, sort of my own business. So what do I do? Well, basically, I advise companies on how to become more diverse and inclusive and equitable. And particularly, a lot of the work that I do is around working with leaders, and a lot of them are men, of course, but talking with leaders about how their companies need to transform, how the cultures need to evolve, how they need to be better places to work for everybody, not just a sort of dominant group, which typically has been, white men, let's face it. So yeah, that's kind of what I do now. And so I'm running workshops, giving keynote speeches for organizations, as well as I would say about half of my time is spent on pro bono things, like I'm now on the board of UN Women for the UK. I mentioned also European Women on Boards, where I'm on the board there. And I support a number of other women-run businesses, for example, as well, because I believe as an ally, you've really got to do things to support women, not just talk about it, basically. So I'm trying to sort of do all of that. And I guess how I got into this in the first place was that I realized in the consulting world, this is like, many years ago now when I joined it, that there weren't many women in the organization. There weren't many women, certainly towards the top of the organization. And I was always curious about that, because when I was at university, with really clever, smart women who seemed to go into other professions or other areas, maybe where they wanted more flexibility or more, there was something else that attracted them. Anyway, it soon became the case at Mercer that we thought it would be great to have a women's network. And I was working with the woman who set it up, and basically just asking questions around, well, what role can men play to support the women's network? And through that's how I started getting involved with being a man that supports women's networks. And then through that, I then got invited to join the board of my first women's network, PWN Global, or Professional Women's Network Global, where I had the wonderful title of Vice President Engaging Men. So my role was to get other men engaged, because the PWN wanted to become more gender balanced.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of like really the start. And then, of course, 15, 20 years ago, I was one of the few men speaking up about this. So, of course, I got a lot of invites to speak at events or be part of various other things. And so I've now got roles in a number of different organizations that are all to do with gender equality and diversity and inclusion. And more recently, I've set up something called Stronger Together, which is trying to bring everyone together that's interested in progress on gender equality across all sectors, actually, to really kind of collaborate and work together to try and to have a louder voice and also to increase our progress. So hopefully that's sort of some of the things. And I think just one other thing really that's on my mind is that there is something in this for men to be involved in this. And I think I often use this Gloria Steinem quote about when she says men make really valuable allies to women, because they're not just helping somebody else, they're freeing themselves. And I think what that means is basically that I can free myself from all the stereotypes that we men typically face about, being strong, being tough, don't cry, don't get involved with anything feminine sort of thing. All of those aspects of the man box kind of I rejected really. And I think that one of the reasons why I think as a man, I'm more drawn towards this whole concept of gender equality, because I want to support women, but actually also I want to create an environment for men where we can be men that are not stereotypical men, where we can be complete men with a full range of emotional, resources available to us, etc.
Wow, what an interesting career journey that you've had, and so nicely summarised there in a couple of minutes. I'm sure you could have told us a lot more. And I think the work that you're doing is admirable. The Stronger Together project sounds really interesting, and we'll definitely share that with our audience. And I couldn't agree more. I think for us to be better allies to each other, having an environment where everybody can be their authentic selves is absolutely essential in being on that journey to having a more equitable workplace. And, we talk about authenticity for women, but I think you've nailed it there. I think definitely being an environment where men can be their true selves and not have to conform to those stereotypes is super important as well. As an advocate for gender equality, then obviously that is where you spend most of your time. You've been doing it, like you said, for 15, 20 years, which just shows how much work needs to be done. Can you share your perspective on the importance of men being allies in an effort to support and empower women, specifically within the tech industry?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, the first thing to say is that we know that the tech sector has real issues with retaining women and providing an environment for women where women want to work. I mean, obviously, there are some bright spots, if you like, but the general picture is one where there's a real challenge with the sector and with the industry. I was actually at a conference in Berlin the week before last called Stay in Tech, which was run by CPIS and a number of other organizations that came together to put this conference on to address the issues about how do we get women to stay in tech. So it's one thing to bring them in, but how do we create an environment where they stay? And one of the things that I was talking about as part of the panel that I was on was about how we make sure that men and the attitude of men towards women in the workplace is one that enables them to stay and doesn't make them want to leave, etc.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for men to show up and be allies. Now we know that in general, because men are sort of 80% of executives and 60% of line managers, we know that if they get involved in supporting women in their organizations and in their teams, they can really speed up the progress towards gender equality. They can really sort of look at women who can advance, they can support them, they can really sort of transform the working environment in their teams to make them places that women want to stay. So we know that men can make a major difference to the experience of women at work. And we've probably seen the research from companies like BCG, which show that 96% of companies where men are involved in these kind of activities, they show progress towards gender equality.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of support for that. And what we know also is that when men are allies towards women, they're much more likely to push for them to be sponsored and promoted. They're more likely to speak up about their capabilities. They're more likely to support them more broadly. And that, I think, is really encouraging for women. I get a lot of feedback from women to say how important it is that they've had either a male ally in the past or they've got male allies now towards their career and their whole feeling about how they work in this. So it's kind of super important. The real issue is getting men to listen to this, because often when I go to conferences, I'm kind of speaking to a lot of women, so I'm kind of preaching to the converted. One of the real challenges I want to do is to get more men involved. So, for example, let's take this podcast.
Yeah.
How are we going to get more men listening to this podcast so they can realize there's a role for them, there's some benefits for them? That to me is the kind of, is part of that challenge as well. So I think in the tech industry itself, I work with a number of tech companies. I see the challenges that the women in those tech companies report about working in that environment. I think there's a lot that men could do to change their attitudes and the way that they approach their female colleagues. And so we'll get onto that obviously about ways they can be allies. But I think there's an absolute need to support and empower women in tech. And I think men can play a major role in doing that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And the women in the industry that I speak to that are in those senior leadership roles, or they're on that navigating journey through from early career through, the ones that truly feel empowered and really inspired within their work environments, typically are those that have those organisations where there is a bit more gender equality, where they may have male bosses that are really supporting and advocating for them. So I think, it is important. And that question that you said, how can we get more men to listen in? That will be my challenge once we've got this recorded and it's out there. I will be on a mission to get men to listen in. Maybe we can go on that mission together.
Oh, absolutely. I'll share the link, for example, to the podcast. I'll promote the podcast and say, guys, listen, we need to listen into this. So yeah, we'll do it together.
We will get them, we will find them, and we will get them on board. I think sometimes when we talk about being an ally, I think sometimes, I don't know, some men, when I speak to them, they don't really understand what it actually means. So in your words, as someone who's worked as an ally for so long, what does being an ally truly mean, and how can men actively demonstrate their allyship in practical ways?
Right. Okay. Well, I think this is an important question, because I often get, sort of men saying to me, look, I really like the idea of being an ally, but I don't know what to do. So this is a kind of classic barrier, if you like, that we have to overcome. Let's just start by talking a little bit about what an ally is generally. And that is typically been defined as someone with, a reasonable amount of power and privilege or advantage who supports someone with less advantage. So obviously in the workplace, there's been a lot of focus on men being allies to women, because men have had the positions of power and advantage and women have been underrepresented. So one of the biggest areas for many organizations is if they can improve that environment for women, they can get more women on board in the organization and they can be more successful. There's lots of great things that women bring to organizations, which organizations that don't have as many women as they could have are really missing out on. So I think that's the first thing to say. But of course, the allyship definition, if you like, these days is changing a little bit as well, because we also talk about being allies to other groups that are underrepresented, whether that's LGBTQ plus or people with disability. There's a whole range of different areas in which we can be allies. And of course, we can almost, so in a sense, be allies to each other. So I say, for example, to women that I work with, can you be an ally to me? Can you support me in what I'm doing? Because, for example, if I'm putting my neck out there on the chopping block by posting stuff on LinkedIn about how men need to show up, and then if I get criticized, it's great sometimes that women come in and support what I'm saying, and they're being allies to me. And sometimes actually, there's a lovely lady called Hera, who is actually one of my best allies. I reach out to her in advance and say, Hera, I'm thinking of posting this. What do you think? And she's really sort of supporting me and giving me perspectives and giving me honest feedback. And sometimes criticism, which is great. It's exactly the kind of allyship that I need. So actually, Hera and I have developed a great working partnership. We can talk a bit more about it later. But we've actually developed an allyship program together now. So from that initial me reaching out to her, her reaching out to me, we've actually now co-created, if you like, a new approach to allyship, which is really going to focus on the whole cross-cultural piece. How do we be allies across cultures, and how do we be allies across intersections? Because not everyone is man and woman. We have a lot of different genders. We have the trans community. We have people that are non-binary. We need to be thinking about allyship in a much broader context. So that's firstly just the sort of context of what being an ally is kind of about. But in terms of practical steps that you mentioned, and I'll focus here on practical steps that men in tech can take, for example, to be allies to women in tech. I think the first one really is just to educate yourself, really, and be more aware of the issues for women in tech. It amazes me still. I go to companies and I ask senior male leaders, so what do you know about the experience of women in your workplace? And they know nothing, or they know very little, because they've never really asked. I mean, maybe there's some surveys that they've done around employee attitudes towards the workplace, but actually the very specific things that women talk about as experiencing at work, often they're not aware of those. So, for example, if women are being, spoken over regularly in meetings, or not getting their ideas heard, or their performance is not being evaluated in the same way that men's performance is being evaluated, there's a whole range of issues that women face in the workplace that actually they say hold them back. And yet, if men were aware of those, they could do something about it, especially if they're leaders and managers. So that's the first thing, I think, to educate yourself, increase your awareness. And there's some great resources, and we can talk about those a bit later. But one of the ones for me that, for example, raised my awareness to the whole issues for women in the workplace, but also outside, was a book called Everyday Sexism by Laura Bates. And it was a great book because it described, she originally collected all these stories from women about the experiences they had of sexism outside the workplace and inside. And, as I read that book, I was like, wow, this is like a whole world that I had no idea of. And of course, why did I have no idea? Because I'm a man. I don't experience any of that. So I think this first thing is we men have got to realize there's a bubble we go around in where we don't see what other people are experiencing. So we need to educate ourselves about what the experiences of others are, so that we can do things a bit differently. And then sort of very practically, speak up in meetings. For example, if you see someone who's taking a woman's idea or speaking over a woman, you can very easily say, look, can we just let, Kelly finish that point she's making, or let's go back to that brilliant idea that Kelly had. You kind of speak up and you boost the woman's contribution in the meeting, particularly if they are being talked down to or being ignored. I think other very simple things are, if there's a women's network in your organization, go along, attend the events that they're running, sort of show your interest, show you want to be a sponsor, and then, or a mentor. And, from that, things will develop. You'll get opportunities to then potentially sponsor and mentor women coming out of that. And then I think also just think about whether you're a colleague or a manager, how are you working? Are you working flexibly? Are you working, in a way that does support work-life balance and supports you being present at home as well for all the things that are important at home? And if it's an opportunity to take parental leave, are you taking your full paternity leave, for example? Those are things that are very strong signals to other men in the organization, and to the women too. So there's quite a few practical steps that you can take, I think, as an ally. I think what you need to work out is, where you feel you can have biggest impact, given the role that you have. But often, it is that first piece of just understanding more about the challenges that women face, and then thinking to yourself, okay, so how can I show up to support women better, the women that are around me?
I get asked that question by men. It's like, where do I start? And I'm like, always start with education. Go and do some learning yourself, and then that gives you the ability then to go and ask questions. And like what you did with Hera, you've got your soundboard then, that person that you can validate and talk to within the space. If we flip it on its head now, in your experience from the work that you've done and the people that you engage with, what are some of the common barriers or challenges that women in tech face, and how can these allies potentially help address some of those issues?
Well, I think there's common barriers and challenges to women at work generally, and then of course there's specific things about tech which are probably more amplified in certain ways. So just in general, one of the things that I see in the workplace is this belief that you need to be always on, you need to be always available. There's a tendency for people to overwork. In other words, the way to get on here is to put as many hours in as you can and be in the office and all of those things. And I think women don't always want to work in that way. It's harder for them to balance everything. And I think increasingly now for men, also they don't want to work that way. They don't want to give everything to a job and not have any personal life or home life or whatever. So I think being aware that that is a barrier that many women face. And, I was on a call a little bit earlier to a CEO, one of my clients. We were talking about, are there the possibility of doing things like part-time roles? And how do you look at part-time work? Is it done? Do you look at it as equally valuable to full-time work? Because there's still an assumption that people that do part-time are somehow less committed, for example. So there's a whole rethinking that needs to happen for the way that work gets done. And I think that's one of the things that, as an ally, you can do. If you're in a position of power, you can do some rethinking about how your work is structured in your team and try and meet the issues that women are facing there. I think some of the other issues, obviously, I think we talked about, lack of mentoring and sponsorship opportunities. I think very clearly there, men can put themselves forward to be mentors and sponsors for women in the workplace. I think also, actually, one of the things I've seen is that men can benefit from being mentored by women.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of women that mentor me. And I think it's been a very valuable experience for me to understand more about how women see things. But, let's face it, women do sort of still say that there's not enough mentoring and sponsoring going on. So I think, more about that. And then I think some of the networking that happens in the industry can be very exclusive of women, because it's based around things like drinking in bars, or it's based around things that sometimes women or others actually don't necessarily want to sort of partake in. So it's thinking through, are there ways in which we can create team bonding events that include everybody. I think those are sort of some of the things that women talk about. And then, of course, these microaggressions, these inappropriate comments, these behaviors that men sometimes display towards women in the workplace. It's, women talk a lot about those. For example, a woman's dress sense might be commented on, for example, or she might be suggested to go and make the coffee or take the notes at the meeting. I mean, it's amazing how common those things still are. And I think, in the tech sector, what I find is that women are saying, we are constantly getting questioned about our capabilities, whether we're good at what we do, the qualifications that we've got. We're kind of questioned all the time. And if we make a statement about something, we're always questioned about why we're making that statement, where men don't get asked that question as much, or they don't get questioned as much. And there's a really interesting book by Marianne Seigart called The Authority Gap, which explains that actually over time we've become a society where men basically don't listen to women as much as they ought to, kind of thing. And basically there's more that we can do to recognize that and listen more to women's opinions, women's voices, read books written by women, watch films made by women, all of those things that we can do more of as men to support that. So those are some of the barriers that we're talking about, and I think some of the ways in which men can support.
Yeah. And I think that last one you mentioned there around microaggressions, I think it's that unconscious comments that sometimes are said, and those gendered stereotypes. It's that, and we talk about why do women leave? It's like that death by a thousand cuts. It's that constant little niggly bits that then make women just feel like, I just don't want to be here, or I don't want to be in this company, or I just don't want to be in this industry anymore. And I think, there's little tweaks, really small things that with more conscious awareness that we could really make proactive change. And that would be proactive change, not just for women. I think it would be for everybody. It would be for some men. It would be for other marginalised groups, which would just make a much more inclusive and more enjoyable workplace for everyone to be.
Absolutely. And just to add quickly on that, I mean, I think one of the things I was doing in Berlin last week, I was in Berlin twice in 2 weeks, which is crazy, was I was presenting at UN Women, the Women's Empowerment Principles. I ran a session on unconscious bias. And, it's clear that bias is a major issue, especially unconscious bias in the workplace, because people don't generally realize that they've got it. But these biases really impact on how we all operate, okay? But obviously there are biases that are particular ones that women get caught up in. So, for example, this bias of experience where, a male manager might say, well, I've never worked flexibly, or I've never worked part-time, and I don't believe it can work, so therefore I'm biased against it, kind of thing. I mean, they may not even say it, but they might have that bias. There's another one about distance, for example. So there's a whole discussion at the moment about whether you're in the office or not in the office. If you're in the office, you're closer to people that might be making decisions about promotions.
Yeah.
Are we aware that those biases exist? Because these biases affect everybody. But in many situations, women are saying, look, we want to work more flexibly. We don't want to be in the office all the time. So how do we get the face time, or how do we get consideration for promotions? We've got to make sure those biases don't kick in there, and we just reward people that are closer to us, the ones that we can see around us, the ones that are sitting in the desk right in front of us, rather than the ones that might be on the other end of a Zoom call or whatever.
No, I completely agree. And hopefully the more we talk about some of these scenarios and situations, the more organisations, senior leadership teams can be a bit more aware and hopefully be a bit more open-minded to some of the changes. And they're, like you said, that they're rethinking of what has always been. Actually, just because it has always been doesn't mean that it's right. And doesn't mean that it's right for how the future way of working should actually be. And obviously we've seen that with the whole hybrid remote in office thing that's played out over the last couple of years. I think if we were to look at companies, so this might be HR teams, it might be senior leadership teams, those that have a real impact on setting that culture for organizations. How can companies create cultures that encourages and supports men in particular to be better allies for their female colleagues?
Well, I think the very simple thing is to show that the activity that men undertake to be allies is valued in the organization. In other words, so I think organizations need to show that they really care about creating great places to work for women, where men are playing a role to be allies to support women in the workplace. And any activity that men undertake to become allies and to practice allyship is valued. So, for example, it might be part of their performance goals, or it's recognized in some way, and it's not just seen as something that a few people do on the side of their desks. And I think particularly if the leaders are doing it, as we know, from my research into all the success factors of companies that are doing this kind of thing well, it starts from the top. So if the leaders at the top are being allies, if they're showing that it's important, if they're carving out time to do it, if they're creating a culture where there's psychological safety basically for people to be coming to work as themselves and being able to express themselves and express their opinions and express their perspectives, then I think that's all part of providing the right environment for allyship to take place. I think the other thing that's very important is having a recognition that this is a culture change that we need to make towards more gender equality and towards more allyship. And so if it's culture change, we need to to think about it as a big project. It's a lot of work to change the culture. It doesn't happen in 3 months. It happens over years, and it takes normally a significant amount of money to spend on the support and resources you need to make that culture change. So I think there needs to be a recognition that it's going to take time, it's going to take effort. You're going to need people dedicated to do it. Their efforts need to be recognized as being central to the business and not just some HR initiative. And then I think obviously companies need to create a culture through things like having workshops, training, education. Again, obviously they need to communicate inclusively as well, but having workshops and training really show that it's important, and they give people the tools to learn how to be allies and better colleagues. So some of the companies I work with have actually set up training programs for the men to learn how to be better leaders in a gender balanced environment, how to be better allies for women, at the same time as running programs for women to help women get more into leadership roles, etc. So I think those are sort of some of the things. And of course, having the right policies that support flexibility, that support parental leave, that support childcare, those are very important aspects too. And that men can have access to those. Again, that enables men to be allies not only in the workplace, but potentially at home as well, which obviously is another important part of it.
Where some companies fall short is they feel it's like a one training session a year approach, and it's going to fix their culture and everything is going to change. Whereas actually it is a multi-pronged focus. If they're truly looking to change their culture, like you said, it's that what programs do you have for your women to support them in their development? But actually, if you want to change men's perspectives, it has to be something that's there for them, and then policies that incorporate for all. So some great advice there, and some really great tips. I was doing a bit of research. I'm obviously always doing bits of research within D&I. Particularly, I focus a lot around the women in tech agenda. That's where my kind of passions lie, and allyship is really big for me. I saw on a recent report that, according to this report, that 47% of British people feel that efforts towards gender equality have gone too far, which is a 9 percentage point increase from 2023. So, that is a pretty significant jump when we know there's a hell of a lot of work that needs to be done to be able to get gender equality within the workplace. In your view, and if we was to look at this from a male perspective, what do you think are some of the barriers that prevent men from speaking up on the topic? And how can we engage men in helping them to create that more inclusive and equitable tech industry, and one where they don't feel threatened or marginalised themselves to speak up, for example? Because I think that's one of the things that I hear a lot. I don't want to speak up for fear of getting it wrong, as one of the examples. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, certainly there are barriers or there are challenges for men that want to get involved in this. Some of it's to do actually with the fact that, a lot of this is couched in terms of things that support women. So, for example, men are not necessarily going to come along to a women's network meeting because they don't see it as being relevant to them. But if you change the name of it and said, we want to have a balanced network meeting, then actually that may be more likely. So one of the things we did at Mercer, for example, was change the name of the Women's Network to the Vine, so that it was kind of gender neutral. And we made sure that the topics discussed at the meetings were ones that would be interesting to men as well as to women, things like career development and personal branding and things like that. So I think it's really inviting men in, firstly, and making it clear that there's a discussion to be had where you want to have them involved in it. I think you do need to recognise the fact that obviously men will be a bit nervous about potentially saying and doing the wrong thing. So I think supportive feedback from women is really important here, and constructive criticism, if you like, rather than just jumping on our heads if we get it wrong. I always remember my first board meeting for the Women's Network, where I was the only man on the board. It's like, do I use ladies or women? Like, which one do I use? And it's kind of like interesting, because these are the things you're not really quite sure about. But over time they kind of really helped me to understand, the best way to work alongside them. I think obviously going back to something we mentioned earlier, men worry a bit about all the, how much time is this going to take? When actually it doesn't have to take very much time at all. If you just incorporate some of these things into the way you do your day job, for example, then actually it doesn't have to take sort of any more time at all. And of course, men also worry about the criticism from other men. Like, why are you getting involved? Why are you going to women's network meetings? I mean, I used to get those questions, The great thing is, and we'll probably talk about this, there's lots of benefits to men from getting involved in gender equality. So if we can talk about the benefits to them, it's going to make them more interested in this. And there's a lot of research that shows actually that the kind of skills that men learn by getting involved with gender equality and diversity and inclusion make them more attractive as leaders for companies now and in the future, because companies are really looking for leaders that know a bit more about diversity and inclusion, that know how to work in an environment where everyone feels that they can belong. And those are sort of some of the skills you can learn from starting to be involved in initiatives and organizations like this. So I think there's so for me, bringing men into this conversation is about showing there's something in it for them too. And a bit of the research that I did, along with Danielle Efi and Darker from Token Man Consulting, we did it at the end of 2022, was we asked men that are already showing up in this space as leaders, what benefits have you seen? And what the men reported actually, that they through the work that they'd done as allies and more inclusive leaders, they'd built better connections and they were more trusted by others than before, which of course, if you're a leader, that's absolutely critical. So as well as being more open to new ideas and learning and being more empathetic and patient and being more emotionally intelligent as a result of all of this work, they were actually also having a better connection with people in their organization, and they felt more trusted, which I think was really, really an important outcome. And as a leader, that's critical. So yeah, let's bring men into this discussion. Let's show them something in it for them too, and show them that some easy things that they can do to get started. And then I think we're going to have a lot more progress. And I'm starting to see that progress happening in organizations that I'm working with. I'm now much more aware of many more initiatives for men as allies, more men getting involved with it. So I think we're on the right path. And I mean, good job too, because we need to speed up the progress towards gender equality.
Definitely.
Because it's going to be 130 years, apparently, according to World Economic Forum. So we need to speed that progress up quite a bit.
Yeah. And I think earlier on we said, how do we get the men to listen? I think you've kind of just nailed it there with how do we get them to listen. The leaders of the future are the leaders that can lead everybody. And I think, the benefit for men is supporting them on how to lead, to lead women, but also other marginalised groups that maybe in the past haven't been so present within the workplace or so spoken about and so active. Well, actually, like you said, it's about that connection. It's about that trust. It's not just about turning up and doing the day job and delivering the results. It's the bigger picture that I think men and workplaces to attract their men to be able to come on board. And like you said, there's some fantastic examples and there's some really great people that I work with who are great allies within the community. I host the Elevate Her Leadership Mentor Programme. On our first programme, we had 7 men that were supporting our women. We had 36 women. The next programme that we've got live, we've got 43 women on that. And I think, again, we've had about 7 men that have turned up to be mentors on that programme. And that's through either me reaching out or them self-selecting them in to be part of that programme. And it just shows, actually, there is a change. And I think it is really great to see. I think in terms of kind of summing up, and we spoke a little bit about this earlier, for men who want to be better allies but unsure where to start, we spoke about the education piece, but where can they start? What advice or resources would you recommend for those men that are listening into this episode today thinking, I want to do something different, I want to start to educate myself? Where should they go?
Okay. Well, we talked about the role of education and learning and being more aware. So let's just talk about some resources that would help with that. So there's a fantastic book called Her Allies, written by Hera Ali, who I'm working with.
Yeah.
And hers was one of the books that I read to help me expand my, kind of work in allyship. And so I'd very much recommend that. There's a book called Good Guys by Brad Johnson and David Smith. That's become a bit of a seminal work in this whole space around allyship. So I thoroughly recommend that. I mentioned everyday sexism so that men can understand more about the issues that women face. There's a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. So I follow a number of women on LinkedIn who talk a lot about the issues for women. That's all free. Just go out there and look at it and connect with them and start to have kind of more awareness about that. Then I think it's about saying, okay, let's find an opportunity to start talking to women about their experiences. So what I would say to any man listening to this podcast is, hey, why don't you go and sort of talk to a woman colleague and say, hey, I've just listened to this really amazing podcast by Kelly and this Elevate group. I'd like to talk to you about some of the things that they were asking in it, like, for example, having conversations to understand more about women's experiences in the workplace. So that's a very simple thing that any man listening in here can do as a result of having listened to the podcast. But then I think start to think, a bit more beyond that, which is, so like I said, how can I show up, for example, at women's network meetings? How do I start speaking up about this as a topic? How do I speak to other men? And this is one of the really challenging things is, how do we get men speaking to other men? Because we're more likely to convince other men to get engaged in this, probably because, there's a sort of certain thing about men speaking to men about this. And then I think the other thing is start being a role model for this. I mean, you don't have to be a leader or you don't have to be a manager. You can just be a role model for allyship in the way that you approach your colleagues, in the way that you do your work, in the way you include everybody, in the way that you support everybody. Kind of be a role model for this. And I think people will really appreciate it and benefit from it. And I think what's really good, I'm seeing now a lot more men who want to get into this space, who want to do more, And I think, we've got now some ways in which we can support them and things we can point them to and direct them to. So I'm really hoping that the tech industry will take all this on board and do a much better job of supporting women and becoming organizations where women do want to work in these environments, and where they see themselves more fully represented and not just in a minority, and they want to stay and they want to contribute. Because face it, tech without enough contribution from women is really quite a worrying proposition, given the problems of the world and the importance of tech now. And so I think it's really important that we have women's contributions in the whole tech space, and so we've got to do everything we can to make that happen.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I think, now is the time. It's been the time for a long time, but, to make that proactive, that real change, because we can't continue with the numbers that we've got. The stat, I think, by Tech Talent Chartership that was shared was 50% of women will leave the tech industry before the age of 35. I mean, that stat just needs to be broken. That 130 years for gender equality, it just needs to go. We need to expedite that as quickly as possible. And so some really great insight there. All of those points around the resources, I will share all of those points that you said, the books and the other bits and pieces on the podcast episode. So for anyone listening in, looking to find out how they can follow up on that, they will be in the show notes. So please do take a look in there for any information. And I'm sure that if anyone wanted to reach out to you, Robert, is that something that's okay? I mean, you're super active on LinkedIn. That's how we got connected, but you okay for LinkedIn reach out?
Oh, of course, absolutely. I love my network and building my network. So please do reach out. I learn a lot from the new people that I connect with, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that I would really benefit from having a connection with. So please do connect and let's have a discussion about how we work together to, keep women in tech, to make tech an environment where women thrive. And as I say, I think that's going to be better for all of us.
Yeah, 100%. Well, we're right at the end of the episode now. I normally finish with a top 3 tips question. So my question for you then, Robert, is what are your top 3 tips for men or women or any gender really looking to be better allies, to support? We're talking about supporting women in the tech industry, but, to showing up and just being better allies for those working within tech.
So I think the first thing is just to probably building on what we've said before, really, just to be aware of each other's experiences. I mean, it's good for women to be, aware of the experiences of men, but it's certainly important for men to be aware of the experience of women and other genders too. So I think this whole thing about, kind of listening to each other is a critical thing, because there's not enough of those conversations going on, I think. I think this thing also about mentoring and sponsorship is pretty powerful. I think whether you're mentoring a woman or a woman's mentoring you or both, that's something which I think is a tip, in the sense of it really elevates your learning quickly in this whole space. So I would very much suggest that. And then I think the other thing to say is, I think we've all got to think about, what do other people see when they look at us and the behaviors and the actions and the things that we say? Are we living and working in a way that fits with our values and the values of inclusion? So I think we need to all think about how we're role modeling this. I think we can all be role models. I think we can look at each other to see how we can do things better and how we can support each other. So I think those for me are the kind of key things that I think we need to start thinking about if we're really going to create change.
Perfect. And any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to leave our guests with before we close out?
Well, going back to the timing of this, I mean, obviously we've been talking about, for example, AI for a long time and the impact of AI. What we know is that tech is playing an increasingly large part of our lives in whatever different form. For example, I'm involved with the quantum development sector as well, the quantum tech sector. So, there's like sectors that are really going to make major differences in our lives and already making major differences in our lives. And we just need the voices of everyone to be involved with that. We don't need these products or these systems or these platforms to be developed, just by particular groups of people, like, for example, typically, white men. So we need to think through, how do we have systems and platforms and tools that we use that have been developed with everybody in mind and that benefit everybody. I think that's the key challenge that we've got right now. And this is why this is so important, because we've got to retain women in tech. We've got to elevate women in tech. And this is a key, part of it for me. This is the key reason why now it is so important to be addressing this.
I think there's been a lot that we've covered on today's episode, and hopefully for anyone listening in, this is that start of that education point for them. This is that start of that awareness point, so they can then go on their journey. And I think everyone's journey as an ally is different, and I think everyone's journey is unique to them. And I think that's really important as well. There's some major advances in tech that's coming, and we need to ensure that they are filled with people from diverse backgrounds, men, women, different genders, different intersections, to ensure that we're creating the future of tech to something that's right for all of us and not just set for a small minoritized group of people. Thank you for sharing your valuable insights and experiences with us today. I found the talk really inspiring and really enjoyed having a chat to you. Your perspectives on allyship and supporting women in tech have been truly enlightening for me, and I'm sure for our audience. And I hope that our listeners have gained a better understanding of the importance of men being allies and the practical steps that they can take to create a more inclusive and equitable environment for women in the tech industry. So thanks for joining us, Robert.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Kelly. And I'm really looking forward to getting the interaction on LinkedIn once we post the podcast as well.